The views and opinions expressed in this special program are not the views or opinions of Tropical Vibes 105.5 FM.
Welcome to Leadership Empowerment. I am Dr. Bernard Young, Managing Director and Trainer at Genesis Leadership Institute, a management and leadership transforming entity operating right here in the Turks and Caicos Islands. Our sponsored program, Leadership Empowerment, is primarily focused in building leadership capacity and transformation to ultimately help leaders across all levels of engagement to successfully pilot change and navigate the many challenges of leading change, leading competition, and in leading complexity in a risk-oriented and diverse cultural, ethnic, and multilingual operating environment. Each week on Leadership Empowerment, we will be exploring the many dimensions of nation building from the perspectives of the family, the church and community development, educational development, political development, entrepreneurship, business and financial empowerment, educational diversification, and the many other regional and global issues, all of which impinge upon and directly affect the mantle of leadership here in the Turks and Caicos Islands. Leadership Empowerment promises each week to deliver credible and cutting-edge educational information in an attempt to responsibly inform and produce a listening audience prepared to take their rightful place in leading the charge of nation building and human development. I invite you, the listening audience, each week to tune in to Leadership Empowerment and be informed by a fresh and vibrant perspective as we seek to light a candle rather than to curse the darkness. Good day to all that are in the listening audience. Dr. Bernard Young of Leadership Empowerment. We seek every week to raise the topic nation building. It's been the primary topic. We've not deviated or altered from nation building because when we look around the length and breadth of the Turks and Caicos Islands, it's our biggest challenge to take the mantle, leadership mantle that is, to sensitize every quarter, every sector, every area where people put themselves out to lead, that our greatest and most daring task is to build this nation, to build the people. It's about human capacity, increasing it. It's about giving people the opportunity to have the very best in their own country. So our focus is to build human capacity. And the funny thing about building human capacity, once people have been established and built, then they can see, they can assess, they can evaluate for themselves. You can't hoodwink them. You can't bamboozle them anymore. You can't pull the wool over their eyes because, as the scriptures put it, once I was blind, but now I can see. So the reluctance many times on the part of leaders to really emancipate the minds of people is simply because people, once their eyes are opened, they will begin to see things as they really are. One of the primary objectives of leadership empowerment is to open the eyes of all that cannot see. And our topic today on leadership empowerment, nation building, the subcaption is killing the spirit of fear. Killing the spirit of fear. Let us open up with a word of prayer. For those that are out there, the call-in number, 649-243-0101. It's going to be a very provocative topic. We're dealing with fear, the fear we see, the cringing fear we see on every quarter in our nation. Leaders fearful to stand up, to say the right thing, to do the right thing, to make the right decision, knowing things are wrong, still going along with it because they just don't want to confront. Let us pray. Father God, we thank you for this beautiful and opportune day. This is the day that you have made. We shall rejoice and be glad in it. We are thankful for the gift of life and health and strength, the vibrancy of your spirit at work in us. Thank you for every opportunity. Thank you for every disappointment, because in every disappointment, it's pushing in a direction to a more sublime and a more profound opportunity. Because I do believe, we do believe, and we do affirm that all things work together for the ultimate good. So, Father, today, on this program for 1 hour, I want clarity of speech, clarity of mind. May I articulate the words from my mouth clearly and succinctly into the ears of the hearers. And may they be receiving the truth. May they be able to separate light from darkness, truth from error, righteousness from unrighteousness. And wherever there are satanic strongholds that have your people bound, where they cannot know or see or comprehend what they need to know, we declare those satanic strongholds broken today in the name of Jesus. We placate the very throne room of heaven. We placate the Senate room of heaven, the cabinet of heaven. We placate and plead our cause on that level. And we are asking you now to send your ministering spirits. Let them be dispatched in the Turks and Caicos Islands, the Bahamas, and all the surrounding region countries, Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic, all of the surrounding neighbor countries, that you rectify everything that is imbalanced. And we decree and declare that all things will be brought into balance. We will see it with our eyes in the land of the living, where you flip the script and turn the tables upside down, so that righteousness, truth, and verity can prevail in every quarter, in governmental quarters, public service, in business and financial circles. May it prevail in our communities, in our churches, in our businesses, in other areas of commerce in this country. May it prevail wherever humans interact with each other in the Turks and Caicos. We ask for righteousness that will exalt our nation and lift our heads up to better and brighter future. In your name we ask it. Amen and amen. Nation building today is our theme. Subcaption topic: you cannot build a nation in fear. You cannot build anything in fear. If we would just utilize a small portion of Scripture, not for any other reason than for the fact that it speaks emphatically to what fear is, torment. The Word of God declares that the Lord did not give us a spirit of fear, but rather He gave us a spirit of power, love, and a sound mind, a sound understanding. Power to rectify, assimilate, ascertain, and know. Power to understand. Power, love, because in the rectifying and understanding and the assessment, we must always maintain the element of love. And love is that people are bound by forces, dark forces, that have them thinking, behaving, and acting in a certain way. And you're not to alienate yourself from people, but rather declare war on the vices and the forces that control them. So he's not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and love. And of course, with that, after assimilating and understanding, you need a sound mind to make sound decisions. And albeit some of the decisions will be harsh and hard, because to rectify the gangrene situation and to avoid amputation, the kind of medicine that must be taken will be very extreme. In fact, it will throw some people into convulsions, but they won't die, they'll live. But the whole idea is to get the whole body well. There's nothing worse than a sickness that you don't know you have, but it's very acute. And not only acute, the kind of sickness that can spread, that can be an epidemic. And fear is a sickness. And it's in epidemic proportions in the Turks and Caicos. As I traverse the land and talk with people in the church, in the many areas of life, and we go over various activities and various areas of engagement and endeavor, this whole thing of fear is very engaging and very gripping. Fear has torment. Fear is a dangerous thing. Fear causes intimidation. Fear causes people to freeze up and not function to the extent and in the capacity they should. Fear. So today, dealing with this subject, I have a very eminent colleague who knows about standing and taking hard decisions of life and all of the like. I have with me in the studio today the venerable friend of mine, Dr. Gilbert Morris, who has a very extreme understanding of some of the tortures that we engage in Turks and Caicos, some of the things that we have developed over the many years that are counterproductive to our growth and development, and indeed counterproductive to the future. And it's always said that if you don't fully understand your present set of circumstances, and you don't understand your history, and you don't have a good grasp of these very vital components of history and the present context of where we are and what we're doing, then we cannot chart a viable course for the future. And that is essentially a very big element in our misunderstanding of interpreting the moment we're in. And we find ourselves making decisions that will sabotage the Turks and Caicos, its people, children yet unborn, which we are now the protectors of, and that's a serious thing leaders have. So my friend today, Dr. Gilbert Morris, thank you for coming, sir.
Thank you.
And I am pleased and honored that you're able to deal with this topic with me today.
Yes.
I made a little switch in the last minute. Normally people like us, we think on our feet. If something changes, no one would ever know.
No one would.
So we're delving into the topic today, nation building.
Right.
Cannot build in fear.
Right.
I was making the assertion that as I travel the length and breadth of this country, and I talk to people in the church, in government, in business and finance, in community, in all the spectrums and areas of engagement where people are responsible for other people as leaders, I sense a strong, fearful, cringing intimidation that I cannot understand, because I don't know if it's in the Kool-Aid, I don't know if in the water, I don't know if it's something germinating in the atmosphere, but there's far too much fear.
Right.
And I also use as a appendage to this whole fear thing just a familiar passage of scripture that God, since we claim to be a God-fearing people, did not give us a spirit of fear,
Right.
but rather he's given us a spirit that renders power, love, coupled with a sound mind. Now that seems so contradictory to me, and I like to keep it real.
Right.
In light of our current context and in light of the current leaders, we see who most times are, for the most part, for whatever reason, running and hiding from standing up
Right.
and being what they must be in this moment. What has been, sir, if I may,
Right.
explode and prick your mind in this area, if I may ask, what has been your experience here? And I'm
Well-
only going from 6 years.
Yes.
Being here.
The issues are typical of almost every country in the Caribbean. Let me say that if you look at it, actually an excellent example has just emerged. The Premier of Bermuda, David Burt, launched, set up with the Bermuda Management Authority or one of their agencies, a cryptocurrency project.
Okay.
When the project was started, everyone said, well, Bermuda does not have a cryptocurrency. Bermuda does not have, is not at the center, it does not have technologists.
Right.
Bermuda does not have, and they just listed off all these things. Why are you going into this area?
Mm-hmm.
And he put together his team. He went around the world. They figured out that no country in the world had cryptocurrency legislation, regulation, management, deployment. No one.
Okay.
So they created the legislation
To accommodate.
to accommodate what was happening in the world. But look at what that does. The cryptocurrency developers were existing in countries where they had no regulation, and they lacked the sort of regulatory authority, and so they were always at risk of governments coming and overwhelming them and saying, no, that's not allowed.
Right.
Bermuda over here then solves this problem, and the leading, most cutting-edge cryptocurrency developers begin to say, Bermuda is where we need to be.
Okay. Let's put a pin right in there.
Right.
A traditional Caribbean leader had a vision of an opportunity.
That's right.
An opportunity that wasn't pre-existing in that country.
No,
up to that
hadn't
point.
been done anywhere else before.
So he saw something. He did the homework. He did the background check. And he developed it to this point where he formulated the required legislation.
Formulated a vision, laid out a strategy,
Wow.
then executed it on something that, across the Caribbean, when you go to a government agency and you say, I want to do X, they say usually, where has it been done before?
That's the first question.
Right. Here, the answer was nowhere. We have the same brains they have. We have the same imagination they have. We have the same capacity they have.
Right.
Why shouldn't we
Create.
and
Yes.
develop? You see my point? And so now there have been over 350, more than that, visits from international companies to Bermuda,
That small little country.
and more than 50 new companies registered, incorporated to do this business.
And it birthed out of a vision.
Right. And Bermuda is holding, in 3 days, a major conference in Miami
On crypto.
on cryptocurrency management and regulation, at which there's probably going to be thousands of people attending who want to be in this business. There's a second point that they did. So here they are, traditional Caribbean country with the same post-colonial management system.
Right.
Usually in this system, when you want to do something, you issue a cabinet paper, you form a committee, you choose the pastor and the former Sunday school teacher, and all these sorts of people. Nothing
who may
against
not
them.
necessarily know anything about the
That's right,
initiative
and we're not denigrating them.
I
because
understand.
There are aunties and uncles, and, deacons and so on. So, but he didn't do that. Here's what they did. Or we usually, as say the Bahamas is doing, put out an RFP, then you get a company, a bunch of companies to come answer the RFP, then you form a committee, or you have a committee that overlooks it. Again, they don't know anything about the business.
Right.
In the meantime, the world is going on. The world is moving.
At a fast pace.
Absolutely. So what he did is he said, I tell you what, I want every Bermudan who cares about this area to have an opportunity here. So we're going to create what is called a sandbox in business. You know, there's a problem. Toyota is famous for this. We have a problem. Mm-hmm. Our engineers don't necessarily know how to fix it, but we're going to put the problem up on a whiteboard, and everybody from the janitor to the chairman can add their solutions, and we come up with a solution.
Right.
So this idea is that everybody in Bermuda who is involved in this space, in this area of inquiry, could come and participate. And what does that do? That person registers. So all of a sudden you have a complete register, largely complete, of all the people who are interested in this area of development. Now, this isn't the first time this kind of thing has been done. The country that is famous for doing this sort of thing was Estonia.
Estonia.
Absolutely. When, in 1990, it was severed from the Soviet Union after Gorbachev's glasnost, perestroika, and so on, Estonia was set out to swim on its own. It had one telephone in the entire country. Right, one telephone.
Okay.
Finland offered Estonia its old phone system.
Okay.
Right? The Estonians said, no, thank you. Only one telephone in the country now. You're being offered free an entire phone system that you've never had before.
Right.
And you have the presence of mind to say no. And you send out a call for entrepreneurs, and they come to Tallinn in Estonia, and they build Skype.
Okay. Now, the first example you gave with the cryptocurrency was what country was
Bermuda.
that? Bermuda. Okay, got that. Bermuda. And then the second example you gave was Estonia.
Estonia. Now, notice...
Now, what are they noted for?
Now, they're noted for... Estonia was noted as being a backwater of the Russian and Soviet Empire. Bermuda is a insurance, probably the world's leading insurance emporium.
Yes.
The key thing here is Bermuda was not limited in its vision by the fact that this was something that had never happened anywhere.
Yeah.
Estonia was not seduced by Finland's kind offer.
Right.
They had a vision for themselves.
Okay. Now, see, this is the delineating mark. This is the clear line of demarcation here.
Right.
Two examples, two situations where countries were formerly occupied
Right.
by another power.
Right.
And after the severing of that situation, they found that they had a presence of mind in a changing environment, a global environment, to develop something unique
Right.
that had their footprint on it.
Right.
That takes leadership.
It takes and to give leadership a table of contents, vision. So the first thing is the vision. Then once you have the vision, you have to have a strategy, right?
Okay, but before we hit the strategy, we got to get past this vision. Because herein lies the dilemma.
Right,
The scriptures allude to the fact that without it,
right.
we perish.
Yes, no, absolutely.
The absence of it, we could be doing the same old thing,
Right.
going the same old motions.
Right,
But the world around us have morphed tremendously.
right.
And what we're doing is proving ineffective, and over time we'll be producing negative returns.
Yes. Well, what ends up happening, you see this very interesting sort of thing that happens. The opposite of vision is really fear, because
Exactly.
what happens is your core is you see small countries, and particularly islands,
Right.
have a terrible go of it. So for instance, a government sits down, lays out a set of priorities. What are these priorities? They are the priorities that have always been there. You've got education, you've got immigration, you've got social services. The Ministry of Finance is there to figure out how to finance and pay
Right.
for these things.
Right.
And so you have to tax, and you got your companies, and you go try to find FDI so they create jobs, and you can get taxes, and it just keeps going on like that.
Right.
Except that that's not a growth model.
But we're also in a global environment
Right.
where that model is dead.
It's under attack and dead. So here's the problem.
Yes.
So you're doing this, a hurricane comes. All of a sudden, you don't have the resources in that system,
Right.
in that method of doing things.
Right.
And then an engineer comes to you and say, no, here's the problem. Everything you have built on this island
Right.
is susceptible to hurricane
Hurricanes.
food,
Right.
right? It's hurricane food.
Right.
So that's a problem.
Yes.
So then you have to think, the scale involved in doing that. Now, India, in 2016, January, Prime Minister Modi decided he was facing corruption in his country, myopia, a cronyocracy in a country with 1.35 billion people.
Wow.
More than 400 million of these people had never had a bank account or an ID.
400 million.
That's right. More than the population of the United States. Yes.
Right.
And then to get it done, he knew that the cronies in his political system would try to sabotage it. So he selected a few ministers, technology colleges all over the country, parts of the military, and he launched a biometric ID program called India Stack over the entire country, and in the space of 11 months got 1.2 billion people on electronic IDs.
Wow. That's quite a feat.
400 million new bank accounts.
But all of that came from that V word.
Vision.
Vision. Okay.
But look at the vision now. It was tailored to the environment in which he found himself.
Right. So the vision was birthed out of the circumstances
Right.
in the environment.
Right.
And there was a leader who wasn't fearful.
Well, not just not fearful, but strategic. He didn't look and wish that his colleagues were more moral, or wish that
right,
people were. He said, "Okay, I'm going to use.
It is what it is."
Yeah, I'm going to use the universities, and I'm going to use the military, and I'm going to make sure I get full
Spread it
coverage
out,
and so
right.
on. And his goal was radical: to eliminate 85% of cash transactions.
Wow. So that also touched on the the persons in the system that were corrupt.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, because if you allowed them to, if people thought those people could influence the system,
Right.
the trust in the system would be dead on arrival.
Right.
So he did that. So these are real time. So you got a tiny country like Bermuda, a small to medium sized country like Estonia,
Right.
and a massive country like India, all doing the same thing. You know, in Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, the first sentence says, "All happy families are happy alike. All unhappy families have their own private misery. All good governments have the same vision.
Right.
All bad governments, you can't invent what crazy things they will." So the important thing here is vision. And so you've got if you live in a country where people just go by rote, and one of the problems we have is we inherited the British system. It's a colonial management system. It's not meant for prosperity or growth. It's meant for coping
And control.
Yes. And so if you're trying to run that system as a growth system,
In a environment that's changed.
that's dynamic,
Right.
I don't care how good you are, how you can't make it work, because the exogenous demands on your system always undermine your best laid plans.
Right.
That's number one.
Right.
Number two, you have a British overlord, so you can't ever be sure
Right.
that you'll get your initiatives passed.
True. Right.
Right. And number three, you have party politics, which no tiny country should have.
Right.
Should have been all independent seats.
Candidates.
Yeah, absolutely, because that would force
True
everyone
change.
everyone who wanted to get ahead couldn't spend all their time demonizing the individual. You'd have to come up with policies.
creative ideas.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So when the government is formed, it would be as a result of the negotiation of policies that benefit the people. You see?
Right.
So at the moment, what you have is a management system that's executive heavy, that risks changes in the legislature based on how people perceive their electability.
Right.
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 So it isn't a question of whether it's good for the country. It's will it get me elected?
Get elected.
Right,
So you
absolutely.
say anything.
Absolutely. and you have to, or if you don't have any ideas, you have to demonize the other person.
And that's the only way out.
That's the only way out.
But then there's a two-edged sword with that, in
Right.
that what's on the leader flows down to the people.
Right.
So if you have an incriminating spirit and a demonizing spirit, and all you can do is pull someone else down,
Right.
you're literally training and teaching your constituents
Right.
to do the very same thing.
Well, we see this all across the Caribbean. In fact, in some countries, it has gotten so far that the leaders of the two parties are actually the heads of the gangs, the criminal gangs on the streets
Wow.
that have the country divided, right? And this is what's pernicious about some of the things, whether you support Mr. Trump or not, I don't really care. I don't care about governments, but one of the things he's doing is trying to create separate tribes. So everything is an either or,
Yes.
right?
Either
Everything
for
is
me or
an
against
either
me.
or, yes. So, and he's not the first person to do it, but he's done it in an explicit way that makes it impossible for people to disagree with each other.
Right.
So there's no disagreement. There's either complete cultish adulation
Right.
or demonization.
Yes, I know.
And so you can't run a country that way. And for small countries, I was in Singapore in 2008 for their elections. The ruling party had 89 seats. Sorry, the parliament had 89 seats. The ruling party had 86 seats.
Wow.
All right? They lost 2 seats, so at the end of the election, they had 84 seats. 84. They traveled around the country for 2 weeks apologizing
For losing those
for losing those seats.
Wow.
Because their view is, if we do what the people require, we shouldn't lose any seats.
Right.
That's their... And so it was very interesting. The biggest issue was, of course, housing, a big housing issue. But what was also the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, George Yeo, he lost his seat during that. And when he lost his seat, I asked him, I said, how do you feel about that? And he explained, and then he talked about the parliamentary debates and so on. And I saw his last debate, and I said, it's terribly civilized and so very businesslike. I mean, it runs very, very like a Rotary Club meeting, maybe even less radical than a Rotary Club meeting. So he said, listen, on your side of the world, you say you prize deliberation, but you don't have deliberation. Right. What you have is a carnival.
Right.
Right? It's illegal in Singapore, in the parliament, to address a person about their personal life.
It is illegal.
Illegal.
So you can't pull a person apart.
No, I can't say, so if we're doing a housing contract, you're on one side, I'm on the other. I can't say, well, Bernard and his people are just doing this because they want, no, the bailiff will come for you.
Yes.
No, you have to say, I read your report, and we commissioned our own report,
right?
And at sections 4, 5, and 6,
right,
our report differs from yours. Right. The other thing in Singapore is ministers have to answer their messages.
Have to. It's mandatory.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if I send you this, if I get up in Parliament and say I sent you the report, and you never responded to me,
right,
that's a critical. So when we talk about leadership, this is what I'm trying to say. Let's put a table of contents into it.
Right.
Because it's vision.
Vision, yes.
And then you have to have a mechanism for execution.
Right.
What they have in Singapore is a mechanism for execution. Right. Not for demonization, not for grandstanding, not for party politics.
Right.
Right?
Right.
But a mechanism for execution.
Okay, now we come back to this sublime topic, which is the theme.
Right.
Nation building.
Right.
Cannot build
right,
out of a model of fear. We heard that fear many times is a byproduct, the lack of compelling vision.
Right.
And in the absence of vision, we traffic in demonizing each other.
Right.
We're hamstrung by a system of government that it's not working to liberate us and to propel us forward to where we want to be.
Right.
In addition to that is the fact that the fearful content of most conversations across the board always filters back to the fact that for one reason or the other, this didn't happen or that didn't happen because this person prevented it or didn't do this or didn't do that.
Right.
We're not really wired presently to kill fear because we seem not wired to have visions that really can work for our environment.
Well, the difficulty, one of the things I've written about in past years was when Caribbean and African governments received their independence, the group that received the independence was not a political party. It was a movement. Movements are almost religious. They have no strategy. They have no, they don't have a a theory on crime. They don't have a theory on immigration. They don't have a theoretical basis.
It's like a spirit.
Right. Their a movement is emotional, and so in the case of most Caribbean countries, you had an English government with a white minority, and you had a vast black majority in an apartheid situation. And then when the government changed, the black people who were in those movements, who thought the leader was making a mistake, that there were strategic decisions that had to be made, that you couldn't promise one group of people over here a certain thing because it wasn't strategically feasible. That black person in the movement couldn't express that because he would be seen, or she, as betraying the movement. Do you see the point?
And that's the thing that happens every time a person. Well, in fact, it ingratiates fear, and it causes fear to keep.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Because anyone that sees something different, if you stand up and say it, you're demonized.
Yes, whereas
as going against.
Absolutely. Whereas that's a movement. Whereas in a political party, deliberation is the method. You're called upon to identify these sorts of things. I wrote a letter to Nelson Mandela just before he became president, and I had it delivered by a minister of foreign affairs who was going to see him. And in the letter I appealed to him, please, I beg you, do not take the presidency of South Africa, or if you do, take it ceremonially and then resign to give the lead. You are Nelson Mandela. You cannot delve into everyday politics. Why? Because the people need a voice against the politicians. Right? And you are the most powerful voice at the moment on earth, against. So let the technocrats get in there, and you, as the voice of the people, speak to them. Of course, I mean, he had other people, more important people in his sphere, saying, no, you have to be the president. Gilbert Morris and them down there talking nonsense. So it went that way, but look at what happened. That led directly to Zuma. Because the ANC is a movement, not a political party. Now look at what has happened. Julius Malema, the radical who pulled out and is insisting on the return of land, confiscation without compensation, he came out of the ANC. Why? Because the ANC never sat down and ironed out a set of technical mechanisms for execution. It was just a movement that said, okay, we are ANC, we have been marginalized, we have been abused, we have been oppressed, we are black, you are part of this, or you're against black people. So any disagreement was, you couldn't get any rational arguments across. And what we have done with political parties in the Caribbean is basically the same thing. In an island like this, let's say that there are 30 areas, distinct areas that you have to be concerned with, right? There are two things a strategist would notice immediately. Number one, all 30 of those areas have some percentage of overlap. In a small place like this, finance is obviously going to be involved in all 30 areas.
Absolutely. So there's an overlap.
Education is going to be involved in all 30 areas, Immigration is going to impact all 30 areas. So that's the first thing a strategist would say. I hear you, you're the minister. This minister doesn't talk to that minister, but you two should be talking to each other.
So there's a cost factor, an inefficiency
inefficiency. So if you brought a organizational culture specialist, they would look at it and say, you could eliminate, of those 30, you could eliminate 10 of them.
10 of them, reduce your costs.
Yes, because there is significant overlap. That's number one. And once you understand that, number two would be that in strategizing between the various ministries, oftentimes there's a human resource factor that could train people maybe across 2 or 3 or 4 different ministries at the same time. So we have the difficulty when we look at these government breakdowns and these small islands, that we've organized ourselves like a big country, right? We've organized ourselves like a large country, but there are people running $100 billion corporations today who are not as busy as our politicians, because there's an organization and a structure in place.
Discipline.
Absolutely. So that's point number one. Number two, when I look at the economies of the Caribbean, I see a cardinal mistake. If you look at Walmart always reinvests an amount greater than its profits in any one year. Which means it borrows, it takes a set of retained earnings, and they may say this is for stabilization and maintenance and so on, and then another portion for reinvestment, but we are going to put that down as seed money to leverage a greater borrowing so that we could grow the company by 10% every year. I'm not saying that that's there.
No, I understand.
So that's just a number. So what does that mean? That means that, take a country. So you have Turks and Caicos. Let's say you have $100 million in the reserve fund or in surplus.
Right.
We either hold on to that, and because we like the statistical look of it.
Right.
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 Debt to GDP is 15%.
Right.
Right. National insurance over 200 million. NHIP maybe 12, 14 million. I don't know, but it's a pay-go, so it doesn't really matter, but we like the numbers. Per capita GDP, 26,000 a year. So we like that number. $100 million in the reserve.
That number is very misleading.
Yes, of course it's very misleading. but that's what the problem when you like. Remember what I said about India?
Yeah, about the model.
Remember what I said about India?
Right.
His vision was tied to the reality of his situation, not the way it looked.
Right.
The reality that he, as a native, knew about India.
Right.
So, you have this situation where we look at all those numbers and we say, okay, great. And I think if you were following the Walmart strategy, you would say, I have $100 million over here. Do I nurse this situation to keep the numbers looking pretty? That's one way of doing things. Or do I follow the Walmart model and say, I have this $100 million over here in my surplus. The law says I can borrow 5 times that. At the moment, borrowing costs are very low.
Right. So
because my debt to GDP is 15%, I have excellent, ratings and so on. So while borrowing costs are low, I'm going to lay out a vision to transform my country from its current state to meet the challenges of the next 30 to 40 years.
You'd come right back to this word.
The vision, absolutely.
Okay.
So that's the vision. So you are looking at your country and you're saying, it's growing on its own at the moment. It's spiraling. It's like a weed
Without any
growing.
predetermined
absolutely. So
focus.
so we're going to frame its natural course of growth and ask ourselves where we can direct that growth to areas that bring advantages, and then we're going to cost it out. And since borrowing costs are low, we're not going to borrow 500 million, which we are allowed to do.
Right.
We're going to borrow 300 million, but we're going to look for a windfall of $1 billion out of that in terms of economic expansion, right? So, for instance, we have a tiny country. So out of that 300 million, we're going to say, we have a goal to transition this country. To transition this country, we need a government mainframe that runs. We need information systems engineers and so on.
Right.
But we have a tiny country, so we are going to have a set of goals. Turks and Caicos is going to be the country in the world with the highest number of information systems engineers. Turks and Caicos is going to be the country in the world in 5 years with the highest number of coders.
Right.
Turks and Caicos is going to be the country in the world with the highest number of electronic record keepers, like medical records and, driver's licenses and all of those. That's a very technical area. You have to be very proficient at that. So, and we're not doing that because we like the look of the way that sounds. We're doing that because operationally it creates a mechanism for execution.
Right. And also it expands and reinterprets and rebrands
Our country. So all of a sudden, absolutely.
else, other than tourism.
Absolutely. So look at what Estonia did. After they built Skype, they didn't stop there. They wired every school with Wi-Fi, and then they declared that Wi-Fi is a human right.
Wow.
They didn't wait for the EU or the Americans or
They led it.
the United Nations. They said it's a human right. So we could say, we could, whatever it is we come up with, access to the beach, I don't know, something, we could do that. We are in a climate danger zone.
Yes.
So we need people who can do things like read buoys that provide information about tidal behavior and, sea rises and, ambient temperatures and things like that. All these sorts of things to monitor our situation. We have the third largest reef system in the world. The third largest living thing on the planet belongs to us.
Right.
Belongs to us. Right? You understand me?
Yes, I read you.
Belong to us.
Lock, stock, and barrel.
This is my point.
But you,
where is
doing with it?
Nobody comes here and says, these people are experts in this thing that is the third largest living thing on the planet. So out of that 300 million, you create that narrative. You monetize that narrative, and you extend it so that you can both make it an acculturation and a commercial space for the next 30 to 40 years. Right? You might say, well, Morris, all that sounds good, but who's going to drive this? How are we going to, we spend this 300, but how are we going to pay for it? Well, this is why, in terms of your strategy and your vision, you have to know what's happening around you.
absolutely.
Right? You have to know what's happening around you. India knows what's happening around itself. That's why it did what it did. Bermuda knows what's happening. They know that the insurance business, the Americans are attacking you on money laundering, so they knew that they had to make a change.
Leaders are more acutely aware and sensitive to the world around them.
Well, they generally have to be surrounded by people who are constantly, and this is why people talk about Lincoln and Kennedy. And I would put in that Benjamin Disraeli, right? The Prime Minister of Britain at the turn of the century. And what's important about these three leaders is that those three leaders surrounded themselves with people who abjectly disagreed with them.
We've run from that.
Yeah, no. These, particularly John F. Kennedy, his cabinet was filled with a bunch, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and all these people.
Views.
Absolutely.
He wanted to hear that.
He wanted to hear. They didn't care whether Bobby was his brother or whatever have you.
Irrelevant.
Absolutely. Lyndon Johnson on the other hand and so on. So these are all people from different walks of life, and Kennedy would basically have a graduate university seminar at every meeting because everyone was so keyed into their own understanding and knowledge that he was able to make the best decisions. And he made mistakes.
Yes.
Right? And it is the same thing with Lincoln. At the time, the country was divided. And Lincoln spent a great deal of... Doris Kearns Goodwin, the American historian from Boston, she wrote a book called Team of Rivals, where she talks about Lincoln's cabinet, right? And this is a cabinet in which you had Democrats, Republicans, people who were borderline anarchists.
Right.
But he was able to get the zeitgeist, the spirit of the country from dealing with these people. So the way a leader, you can't have this vision of a leader sitting in a room with 75 books and reading and going, boy, I really have to know it. No. The leader is the one it has to be Solomonic. Solomonic, where you sit, you hear all sides, and as Solomon, you decide. Yes, absolutely.
For those of you listening, we're on leadership empowerment. We're dealing with nation building, and we cannot build a nation in fear. Examining the context, why we're so fearful, but looking at it from the primary perspective of vision, the absence of vision, and the absence of the kind of leadership spirit that is not intimidated and not afraid to engage people who think differently, who may not necessarily agree with what the leader's thinking, but will cause that thinking to be energized and sparked. It's almost like iron sharpening iron.
Yes, absolutely.
And to create that kind of atmosphere where you want people around you to challenge the idea so that what comes out of you now is the best possible decision.
Absolutely.
Not a room full of people who agree with you only because you wear the same color, or your homies together, or your family members twice removed. But you really want to attract the brightest and the best resources around you. Because we're making decisions, leaders out there, that's impacting 20, 30, 40 years down the road.
That's right.
And who wants to be responsible for damning the future?
Well, this is a very interesting point because I'm writing a book about Brexit, and I've been completely unimpressed by Michael Gove, whom I've spoken to, Boris Johnson, who ought never to be allowed anywhere near the Prime Minister's office. But Prime Minister Theresa May has also shown herself to be clueless as to what to do. And it's very interesting. Britain is one of the founders of every major international organization, right? In the last 100 years. I mean, long before that, but the last 100 years at least, where internationalism was important, Britain was at the center of all. So Britain has never had to apply to join anything. And
grandfather did.
Right. And one of the things that they don't understand, and you see it at all levels, and even some of my former professors at university who are advising the government, right, some of whom I speak to, they have no clue of what it means to be outside. And, Britain outside of Europe is basically Trinidad with the Queen.
Right.
All right. I mean, it's not a major player. It's not Canada. It's not a dominant player. Now, in terms of institutions, tradition, history, Britain is one of the 3 or 4 most important countries in the world. Right. Whether you like British people or not, it's one of the 3 or 4 most important countries in the world.
Right.
And Britain has found itself in this kind of situation. Number one, it always saw the Brexit vote. Well, the Brexit vote was cynical to start with, but it always saw the final vote, as getting out of Europe, rather than saying we should negotiate in a way to force Europe to reform so we could find a rationale to stay. Because if we could reduce it to a trading co-op with the European, Declaration on Human Rights continuing extant, then we'd have the best of both worlds. So they didn't see that vision. That's number one. My argument with Michael Gove,
leadership again.
Right, Michael Gove and Boris Johnson, who led the no vote, they never had a vision for Britain outside of Europe. And you can't just sit down and say, we want to do this, we want to do that, we want to do it. No, you have to think, what will Britain look like 50 years from now?
Right.
So that's where you have to go.
Right.
Then you have to bring in people and let them walk you back and say, if you want to end up here,
Yes.
these are the steps you have to do right now, and this is what it's
Right.
going to cost you.
Right.
That's how you plan
Right.
a
But
vision.
we're
Yeah.
running, for the most part, in the Turks and Caicos, and
Right.
Bahamas, and the other regional
Right.
countries.
Right.
Our model of leadership is patented and cut off
After
the
them.
British
After them.
system.
One of the things I didn't make clear to you, I said that there are two things when you look at any government strategy. There's the overlap, but there's one more thing. There's overlap between the 30 areas, but there's one more thing. I should have sort of identified that very specifically, and that is, of those 30 things, there are at least 7 to 10 that every government would agree to, no matter when they're in. But we throw out the baby with the bathwater and say, instead of saying, the first thing every government should do when it comes to power, whether it's the incumbent or a new government, is sit down with the old one and say, this is the concordat. These are the 8 things that whether we are in government or you are in government, these things have to stick to. Right? So the 2 things you want is, these are the things we must stick to because it makes no sense changing them.
Right.
Right? So when we enact, we're going to have these 10 things, and the leader of the opposition and the premier are going to stand shoulder to shoulder
On these
when we announce
8
these
issues.
things, because they don't change. Right? And then on the things where there are overlaps, the government itself, its first job is to streamline and make efficient
Right.
those things so that you don't have these overlaps. And I'll give you an example. I was asked by people in government in the Bahamas now, before they took over, well, how do we solve the financial services problem? The U.S. is just hammering us. And I said, that has to do with national security. They go,
Right.
no. I mean, there's financial services and there's national security. And I go, no, they're the same thing. And they say, well, what do you mean? And I say, well, it's actually not only the same thing, it's 3 things. So you have the defense force.
Right.
The defense force are all over the Bahamas, everywhere, every nook and cranny, all over the Bahamas. All right. The U.S., under their homeland security, they want certainty of security.
Right.
Certainty of security. You sign an agreement with them for joint exercises with the defense force all over the country.
Right.
Maybe pre-clearance airports in the big areas, like Exome, Eleuthera, further down into the Bahamas and so on, so that their fear is having people clear U.S. immigration on U.S. soil. So back that out to your places. That's good for you. And then don't just do that and then go, we are friends with the Americans.
No.
You put your thing on the table. We want to be treated like Delaware, like Colorado, all the financial centers you have in your country, where they're not subject to the FATCA.
Right.
Protect us from the OECD.
Right.
Just like you're not subject to them, we don't want to be subject. We don't want to engage in money laundering. We don't want to engage in tax evasion. But we want so we can stop responding to these blacklistings and so on. So all of a sudden, you get greater security. You're speaking at a higher level to the U.S. government, right? Because you're involved in providing their security. And you've given yourself, if you say, I want a million companies in the United States to be able to invert to our jurisdiction tax-free, that's $1 billion in fees. So you've just given yourself $1 billion in fees. They don't care. I mean, $1 billion is nothing for them. But have it if we can get security. If we can have people clear our customs immigration outside of the United States. So again, a strategy relevant to your circumstances.
Zone,
absolutely.
Your area.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's very interesting. Yeah. I've had on the program today Dr. Gilbert Morris talking a little bit about nation building from the perspective of this cringing fear that we seem to have, and we saw that a lot of it ties back to the lack of vision lack of fear, of having people around us that would challenge our ideas and challenge our thinking and sharpen the sword and cause us to be better as leaders. And we're going to continue this. I'd like for you
absolutely.
to come on next week.
I would love to.
And let's continue to develop this thought and see if we can bring some sense out of the madness.
Right.
Certainly not in the Kool-Aid. But for those of you that's listening today, thank you for listening in to Leadership Empowerment. And as I always sign off, wake up, everybody. No more sleeping in bed. No more backward thinking. Time for thinking ahead. Wake up, political leaders, church leaders, family leaders, business leaders, community leaders, leaders in the government, leaders in every sphere of engagement in the Turks and Caicos. If you hold yourself out, it's time to wake up. God bless you, and God bless the Turks and Caicos Islands.
The views and opinions expressed in the preceding program are the show host, their guests and callers, and not the views or opinions of Tropical Vibes 105.5 FM.
Thank you for tuning in to Leadership Empowerment this week. We trust that we have challenged you today to be an instrument of progressive change as we collectively enhance and improve the people of our nation to take their rightful place as the possessors and inheritors of this great land. We look forward to seeing you next week.